The EU Parliament this term is going to be the first of its kind in history to have such a huge number of MEPs from the right side of the political spectrum. Consider firebrand Eurosceptic leaders like Hungary's Orban, staunch nationalists and anti-immigrant politicians like France's Marine Le Pen and Italy's Meloni, sitting alongside liberals and socialists from the Greens and S&D, and this might as well be the most divisive of all EU houses. As the parliamentary elections for the 24-29 term of the European Union took place in June this year, they were watched around the world with much anticipation. The centre-right European People's Party, the EPP, emerged as the biggest bloc with 186 out of the total 720 seats, while Socialists and Democrats secured the second place with 136 seats. EPP is led by Germany's Ursula von der Leyen, who has been voted the Commission's president for the second time in a row. The most notable aspect of this term's election results was the prevalence of right-wing parties in the EU. The Patriots for Europe, led by Hungary's far-right leader Viktor Orban, ended up bagging 84 seats in the parliament, while the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's group, the European Conservative and Reformists or ECR, followed close behind with 78. René Oss, leading Alternative for Germany, a party accused of being Nazi sympathizers by the left, will also be in the parliament this term. And at the heart of this year's elections was the passionately debated immigration policy. So what's this immigration debate that's dividing Europe all about? We talked to Samuel Davidoff-Gore, the Associate Policy Analyst at the Migration Policy Institute, Washington, D.C.
There is a trend that we see in Europe and that we see in other areas, certainly in the United States, that there are questions about how to make the asylum process quicker, how to make it more efficient, and to a large extent, how to make it fairer. There is certainly a securitized aspect to the debate in Europe. There are certainly a lot of rhetoric, especially coming from certain political parties that really take a threat narrative or a security narrative to migration policy.
Europe has witnessed periodic migratory waves over the years, but a widespread trend of immigration from Africa and Asia emerged as early as the 70s, when people from former European colonies started pouring in seeking shelter and better opportunities. With wars raging across the Middle East and Afghanistan at the turn of the century, the number of refugees and asylum seekers suddenly shot up, culminating in the immigration crisis of 2015. Around 1.3 million refugees came to Europe in 2015 alone, of which 3,771 were reported dead and missing. The sight of millions of dark-skinned people entering European territories in decrepit boats sent a wave of panic across European nations, and since then their asylum policies have only grown stricter. Populists have been riding the wave to fuel hostile narratives against refugees and migrants in many states. Their common talking points include migrants stealing local jobs, burdening local economies, and being responsible for an increase in crime and violence in host countries. Politicians like Hungary's Viktor Orban have publicly called migrants a poison for Europe, while Italy's Giorgia Meloni has based her entire political career off her anti-immigrant rhetoric. Meloni and her far-right MEPs have called for stealthier border controls and lax externalization policies to cut short the number of refugees reaching Italian shores. In fact, externalization of European security will be one of the key agendas in the EU this term.
You also see, lots of thinking about how to externalize asylum processing and how to basically do more of the asylum vetting process outside of Europe's borders. And I think a lot of the time when we say externalization, we think of kind of, keeping migrants, in far away places and, trying to make sure they don't reach, European shores, but that doesn't have to be the case. I think there are lots of arguments to be made that, if you can set up an orderly system that allows for vetting and for different aspects of the process to take place before someone takes the dangerous journey to Europe, you're actually making it safer for migrants and asylum seekers.
The new Migration and Asylum Pact, which was finally approved by the 27-nation EU bloc in May this year, around 4 years after it was conceived, aims to legalize externalization. Through one of its legislative parts, the Asylum and Migration Management Regulation, it proposes a new governance framework for migration and asylum, replacing the current Dublin III regulation that has been in place since 2013. Under the Asylum and Migration Management Regulation, the EU states are bound to extend solidarity to member states who are bearing significant migratory pressures. Countries like Italy, Spain, and Greece are at the front line of this crisis because of their geographical proximity to the Mediterranean immigrant route. Most immigrants from sub-Saharan and North African regions reach Italian shores by sea while traveling through Libya and Tunisia. The immigrants entering Greece, Cyprus, and Bulgaria mostly come from Syria by going through Turkish waters, while Spain receives the bulk of its refugees from Morocco and Algeria. According to the UNHCR, some 29,696 people have entered Italy alone this year. Under the Solidarity Clause, the member states can choose to assist the frontline country by either relocating asylum applicants to their own territory or providing monetary compensation for asylum processing.
I think since 2015, 2016, you've seen a real fight to try to kind of preserve what there is. And this is where the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum comes in, from this idea that the previous system which is called the Dublin regulation, but this old system, was not necessarily working. In particular, this idea of who was shouldering the greatest burden for taking in migrants and asylum seekers, and processing their claims and integrating them eventually. So I think the attempt in part with the the new EU Pact, is that there's going to be more sharing of responsibility across different member states.
However, in May this year, when the new pact was presented for approval in the parliament, Orban had voted against this proposal on grounds that he did not want Hungary to contribute monetarily towards more immigrants. Now, externalization of security is nothing new to many European countries. In 2008, Italy entered into a deal with the Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi to halt immigrant flow from Libya and establish joint naval patrols to intercept illegal migrant ships. The agreement was dubbed as a dirty deal by the Human Rights Watch. Paying no heed to criticisms, Italy has signed another agreement with Albania this time to establish 2 asylum processing centers in the Western Balkan country. Migrants intercepted by Italian coast guards will be rerouted to the Albanian centers and will be detained there while asylum applications are being processed. This usually takes months, but the new pact aims to speed up the process. We asked Mr. Davidoff-Gore about his take on the Italy-Albania treaty.
This is an interesting example because it has the potential to work. There isn't necessarily, it's not like Italy's trying to send everyone to, a country, in the middle of Africa or in the middle of, far away. They're going to Albania, which is, quite close to Italy. And from my understanding, the Italians will have, I think a relative amount of control over the process, which means that they, and I'm not entirely sure because I'm not a lawyer, but I'm fairly sure there'll be, Italy will have some legal responsibility. But I think the criticism that it does take much longer to get to Albania is a really valid one.
Although legalization of externalization is good news for EU countries, critics argue that externalization policies can lead to human rights violations, as migrants may be intercepted and held in countries with poor human rights records. This has been documented in case of the EU's deal with Tunisia in 2023, which was passed without any human rights safeguards and resulted in the abuse and killing of many immigrants in Tunisian detention centers. This sort of externalization also paves the way for the exploitation of low-income and middle-income countries like Libya, Tunisia, and Albania, since there exists a clear power imbalance. Libya, for instance, has remained an Italian colony for a long time, and Italian oil companies have vested interests in such deals on Libyan soil. Additionally, according to the 2023 UN Global Compact Indicator report, developing countries, not wealthy ones, hold most of the world's refugee population.
I think it goes to speaks to a lot of the criticism of, not just the EU Pact, but also the EU's, wider migration and asylum policy and the deals that it has made with, certainly with Libya, both in the Gaddafi era and then the post-Gaddafi era, where you don't have any real functioning central government, and you are dealing with, a quote-unquote Coast Guard that, is perhaps a glorified militia on boats. Certainly, most recently, you've seen intense outreach to Tunisia, with a president who is increasingly turning authoritarian and autocratic, and has certainly unleashed a wave of racialized, anti-Black rhetoric in Tunisia. So there are huge concerns, and I think that the critics who say that Europe should not be dealing with these countries are to a certain extent correct in that they are enabling some of the worst tendencies without necessarily getting much movement on the human rights side in return.
Concerns about the lack of accountability and transparency in the EU's partnerships with third countries have also been raised, despite claims by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International asserting that the pact is only going to add into the suffering of refugees and asylum seekers. The EU has vowed to go on with it. European Commission's President this term, Ursula von der Leyen, has assured that humanitarian principles will be upheld when legislating for immigration and asylum policies. But with leaders like Marine Le Pen, Giorgia Meloni, and Viktor Orban in the House, many believe that Ursula and her allies are in for a tough time ahead.